He impregnated his own daughter twice before she turned 15. This is the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, a case that sent shockwaves through the small community of Rabun Gap in the 1970s. An isolated family in the Appalachian Mountains, their dark secrets were buried by generations, until an inevitable collapse brought a grim reality to light, a reality many would have preferred remain unknown. The setting was Rabun Gap, Georgia, in 1978. This was a mountainous area where time appeared to move more slowly than in the rest of the nation. Isolated communities held fast to their own traditions, shielded by deep valleys and precarious roads that discouraged outsiders. Within this landscape, the Dawson family constructed a reality of their own, a world apart from external scrutiny and the laws of conventional society. In 1978, Willard Dawson was 42, a descendant of one of the first families to settle that region back in the early 19th century. His ancestors had arrived as pioneers, claiming the high lands where they established a small rural property. Over the generations, the Dawsons became known for their isolation and a deep distrust of strangers, rarely venturing into town except for essential supplies. The Dawson property sat roughly 12 kilometers from the nearest city, at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains. The main house was a visibly deteriorated, two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather. A partially collapsed barn, a water well, and some cultivated areas completed the property, which was home to Willard, his wife Martha, and their 5 children. Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins, was Willard's second-degree cousin. The two had married when she was just 16, following a long-standing family pattern of unions between relatives. Martha possessed an erased countenance, her eyes always downcast, and she rarely spoke around strangers. At 38, she appeared far older, the result of a life of hardship and the physical and emotional toll of multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions. The couple had 5 children, 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8, all shared similar physical traits, below-average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Jacob and Thomas already displayed signs of erratic behavior, swinging between periods of apathy and unexplained aggressive outbursts. This story began to surface when 15-year-old Sarah Dawson was taken to the regional hospital after fainting during a rare trip to town with her father. What the doctors discovered that day would trigger an investigation, unveiling decades of a practice modern society deems one of its greatest taboos: improper relationships within the same family, resulting in children with severe developmental issues. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now so you don't miss these impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. These are truths few have the courage to tell, but they must be known to prevent them from ever being repeated. Dr. Richard Thornton remembers the day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton's Community Hospital with perfect clarity. It was a cold October morning in 1978, and the 15-year-old was unconscious when her father carried her into the emergency room. Willard Dawson explained his daughter had fainted while carrying shopping bags and that it wasn't the first recent occurrence. There was something about his demeanor that bothered me immediately, Dr. Thornton recalled years later. The way he avoided eye contact, how he insisted on staying by her side, how nervous he seemed when we suggested more detailed tests. The initial exam showed Sarah was severely anemic and dehydrated, but it was during a more comprehensive assessment that the truth started to emerge. The teenager was pregnant, approximately 5 months along. Confronted with this, Willard grew visibly agitated, insisting he needed to take his daughter home immediately. It was at this critical moment that nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. Sensing signs of possible vulnerability, she created a private moment with Sarah while her father was directed to fill out administrative forms. When we were finally alone, I asked her about the pregnancy, Elaine reported later. She looked at me with the emptiest eyes I've ever seen and said simply, "Dad said it's like this for all the girls in our family." This statement, delivered in a near whisper, was the first indication of the horror unfolding on the Dawson property. Grasping the severity of the situation, the medical team immediately contacted local authorities. Sheriff David Miller, who led the Rabun County Police Department, arrived at the hospital in under an hour. Willard was detained for questioning, while Sarah was kept under medical observation. The authorities secured a search warrant for the Dawson property, where they found Martha and the other 4 children. The house revealed alarming living conditions. Though a diesel generator provided electricity, there was no running water or proper sewage. Rooms were sparsely furnished, with mattresses scattered on the floor. The pantry held little food, mostly canned goods and some vegetables from the garden. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery of a girl around 2 years old hidden in a back room. The child, who existed in no official records, had several worrying physical characteristics: a head disproportionate to her body, wide-set eyes, and difficulties with movement and communication. Martha Dawson, questioned through tears, revealed this was Emma, Sarah's daughter. And according to Martha, Emma's father was Willard himself. Preliminary investigations showed Sarah had given birth to Emma when she was only 13. The girl had never been registered, never received medical care, and her existence was unknown to any authority. Sarah was now pregnant again, also by her father. As the investigation progressed, an even more disturbing picture emerged. School records indicated Sarah had attended local school only until age 10, when Willard stated he would homeschool her, something that never occurred. The 3 boys had also left school early, and the youngest daughter, Rebecca, had never been enrolled. Neighbors from the closest properties, though kilometers away, reported rarely seeing the Dawson family members. They came to town maybe 3 or 4 times a year, a local merchant reported. Always with 1 or 2 children, never the whole family. They bought large amounts of supplies and returned to the mountains. If you tried to make conversation, Willard would cut it short and leave. The investigation also revealed the family survived mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins hunted by Willard and the older boys, along with small-scale subsistence farming. Old documents showed the Dawsons had received a significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s, explaining how they maintained the property despite limited income. But a darker aspect was just beginning to surface. The family's patterns of consanguinity dated back at least 3 generations. Old county records indicated Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins, as were their parents. This pattern of close relative unions had created an extremely closed genetic lineage, resulting in a host of physical and cognitive problems that grew more severe with each new generation. As Sarah Dawson regained her strength in the hospital, her story took shape through fragments shared with her designated caseworker, Elena Winters. With patience and sensitivity, Elena gradually gained the trust of the teenager, who had been raised to distrust anyone outside the family. "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us," Sarah repeated, clearly echoing a lifelong lesson. "Dad always said only within our family could we be truly safe." The reality emerging from these conversations was deeply disturbing. According to Sarah, when she turned 12, her father began treating her differently. He explained that in their family, it was tradition for fathers to teach their daughters about adult life. Martha, her mother, had been quietly complicit, having undergone a similar experience with her own father decades earlier. When Sarah became pregnant the first time at 13, there was no medical attention sought. Martha, using knowledge passed down through generations, acted as the midwife for Emma's birth. Asked how she felt about giving birth, Sarah showed a disturbing lack of understanding. "Dad said I was special because I gave the family a new, perfect member," she explained with devastating simplicity. "He said Emma was more perfect than others because she came straight from him to me." Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations revealed the devastating impact of her isolation and trauma. Though chronologically 15, her cognitive and emotional development was significantly delayed. She struggled with abstract concepts, had a limited vocabulary, and, most worryingly, showed no awareness that what had happened to her was wrong. If you are feeling deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. Leave justice for Sarah in the comments to show we cannot tolerate children growing up in environments of exploitation and neglect. Your voice is crucial to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Meanwhile, the investigation into the other family members uncovered more layers of this disturbing case. Jacob and Thomas, the older sons, showed clear signs of cognitive deficit. Psychological evaluations placed their intellectual development at that of 9 or 10-year-olds, despite their ages of 19 and 17. Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8, also showed significant developmental delays, alongside health problems like hearing difficulties, congenital heart issues, and dental malformations. Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, underwent medical evaluations that confirmed initial suspicions. The 2-year-old had multiple conditions stemming from consanguinity. Beyond the observed physical traits, she was diagnosed with heart problems, low immunity, and significant neuromotor developmental delay. Doctors estimated she would likely never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4- or 5-year-old, even in adulthood. Martha Dawson, when she finally began speaking to authorities, revealed her own story mirrored Sarah's. Born Martha Collins, she was the daughter of a first-degree cousin to Willard's father. At 15, she was offered to Willard as a wife, continuing a cycle she believed was normal within that family branch. "My mother told me this was how things had always been done," Martha explained in a recorded statement. She said keeping the family blood pure was important, that mixing with strangers brought weakness. The investigation revealed this thinking had deep historical roots. The Dawsons' ancestors came from the Scottish Appalachians in the early 19th century, bringing beliefs about maintaining pure family lines. Isolated in the Georgia mountains, far from the social evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived but intensified over generations. The most alarming discovery came when investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935. In them, Edwin Dawson detailed his disturbing views on preserving family purity and how he had instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue the practice. The diaries also contained almost clinical observations on the results of these unions, noting the children's physical characteristics and which were considered successes or flaws. These documents provided crucial evidence that consanguinity in the Dawson family was not an isolated case but a deliberate system maintained for generations, resulting in an increasingly compromised genetic line. Willard Dawson's trial began in March 1979, quickly becoming one of the most notorious in Georgia's legal history. The prosecution, led by Howard Reeves, presented a meticulous case supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of the Dawson family members. The Rabun County Court, a red brick building from the turn of the century, could barely contain the public interest. Journalists from Atlanta and national outlets followed every development, while the small community of Clayton tried to process the horror that had existed so close to them for so long. Willard remained impassive throughout, rarely showing emotion. His state-appointed defense lawyer, who clearly struggled with the case, argued based on his client's cultural isolation and ignorance of modern social laws. "My client is the product of generations of mountain isolation," the lawyer argued. He was raised believing these practices were normal within his family, without access to the education that could have corrected this distorted view. This argument was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, which presented evidence that Willard frequently visited town, had a functional radio, and had even worked briefly at a local sawmill in the early 1960s. He had sufficient knowledge of the outside world to understand his actions were condemned by society, argued prosecutor Reeves. The most impactful testimony came from Martha Dawson. After months of psychological counseling, she broke decades of conditioning to speak about her experience. In a trembling voice, she described being handed to Willard as a teenager, being kept isolated, and becoming a silent accomplice to the horrors against her own daughter. "I knew it was wrong," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But when you spend your whole life being taught that questioning is treason, you lose the ability to oppose. I failed my daughter, and I will never forgive myself." Medical and psychological experts detailed the devastating effects of multigenerational consanguinity. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist from Emory University, presented a detailed Dawson family tree, demonstrating how the restricted genetic pool had concentrated harmful recessive genes. "What we see in the Dawson family is a textbook example of the dangers of endogamy," Dr. Freeman explained. "When close relatives have children, the probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting increases dramatically. In this family, where this practice occurred for at least 4 consecutive generations, we see a cascade of genetic problems growing progressively more severe." The doctor described how the problems observed in the older Dawson children, cognitive deficits, heart problems, physical malformations, were direct consequences of this pattern. But it was his discussion of Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, that proved most impactful. This child represents what we call extreme inbreeding depression, he explained. When a father has improper relations with his own daughter, who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage, the result is an even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes. The chances for serious developmental and health problems exceed 70%. Medical reports on Sarah's second pregnancy, still ongoing during the trial, indicated the fetus already showed signs of multiple developmental complications. Doctors predicted that if the pregnancy went to term, the child would likely have even more severe conditions than Emma. As the trial advanced, the community began questioning how this situation could have persisted unnoticed. Local school officials were criticized for not investigating when the Dawson children stopped attending. Social services faced questions about the lack of visits to the isolated family with multiple children. Prosecutor Reeves directed part of his accusation at the systemic failure that allowed the Dawson tragedy to continue. "This is not just the judgment of one man," he declared in his closing argument. "It is the judgment of a community that averted its eyes, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just kilometers from where we sit today." After 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Willard Dawson was found guilty on all counts. Judge William Hartford, visibly moved by the case, delivered the maximum sentence under Georgia law at the time, 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences, ensuring Willard would never leave prison. 45 years have passed since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the nation. The consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate, not only for the survivors but also as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect. Willard Dawson died in Georgia State Penitentiary in 1997 at age 61, never expressing remorse. Martha, after serving 5 years for complicity, spent her remaining years in an assisted living community for people with mental disorders. She died in 2012 from heart complications, another common result of generations of consanguinity. The fates of the Dawson children followed different paths, all marked by trauma and genetic consequences. Jacob and Thomas, the older sons, never achieved independent living due to their cognitive limitations. Both spent decades in institutions for adults with disabilities. Thomas died in 2010 from kidney failure, and Jacob remains in supervised care. Samuel, who was only 10 when his family was discovered, received specialized education and intensive care. Though he never fully overcame his cognitive deficits, he eventually learned a trade and today lives in an assisted community, working in an adapted carpentry workshop. Rebecca, the youngest daughter, responded best to intervention. Adopted by a family of university professors, she received special education and extensive therapy. Despite learning difficulties, she completed the equivalent of high school and now works as a library assistant, having found stability and a significant degree of independence. Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case, faced a long, difficult recovery. Her second pregnancy resulted in a boy with multiple severe conditions who died before his first birthday. Sarah spent years in intensive psychological treatment, gradually understanding the magnitude of her suffering. At 19, she took an extraordinary step. She decided to speak publicly. In a 1982 interview for an educational documentary, Sarah, with a clearer understanding of her past, expressed her desire for her story to serve as a warning. "I don't want anyone else to grow up thinking that was normal or acceptable," she said. "I want people to understand that isolation isn't protection. It's a prison." Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, grew up under specialized care, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite pessimistic predictions, she surpassed some expectations, developing basic communication skills and a degree of independence in daily activities. However, she never progressed beyond the cognitive level of a 6-year-old. Emma died in 2001 at age 25 due to congenital heart complications. Sarah eventually built a life for herself. After years of therapy and remedial education, she married a teaching assistant she met in a rehabilitation program. They had no children, a conscious decision based on both her trauma and the genetic risks she carried. She dedicated her adult life to volunteering with programs focused on preventing family isolation and detecting warning signs. The Dawson property in the Georgia mountains was eventually demolished by county order, the site considered a monument to human tragedy. The area has been reforested and is now part of a nature reserve, with no indication of the horror that existed there for decades. The most important legacy of the Dawson case was its impact on public policy and social consciousness. After the trial, the state of Georgia completely revised its child protection and remote family monitoring protocols. New laws required regular checks on families who chose homeschooling and created a more robust system for detecting school abandonment. The medical community also learned valuable lessons. Clayton Community Hospital developed specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships, and health professional training across the region began including modules on detecting genetic problems indicative of consanguinity. Genetic experts extensively studied the Dawson medical records, scientifically documenting the devastating effects of multigenerational consanguinity. These studies are now used in educational programs worldwide, clearly illustrating why taboos against close relative relationships exist in virtually all human cultures. In 2008, a prevention and education center was named Project Sarah in honor of Sarah Dawson and her journey of survival. The Atlanta-based center offers educational resources and support for survivors of improper relationships, as well as training for professionals to identify at-risk families. Sarah passed away in 2019 at age 56, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. Her funeral was attended by dozens of professionals inspired by her story to work in child protection. One of her final wishes was for her story to be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful, necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where the unthinkable becomes reality. The Dawson history reminds us that even in society's deepest shadows, intervention, healing, and change are possible. It also reminds us of our collective responsibility to recognize when something is wrong, not to look away from discomfort, and to ensure no child grows up believing suffering is normal or acceptable. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now to access deep investigations into cases society prefers to forget, but we must remember to prevent their repetition. If you've watched this far, you appreciate this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can know you and see who truly values the stories on this channel. Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who value the truth, however difficult it may be. This was the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity. A story that reminds us that even in the most remote communities, no one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and the law.